Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on. And today, we're going to be looking at Vigil, the least shortest night for the Nintendo Switch. Or for those of you who just abhor redundancies within the superlative case, Vigil, the longest night for the Nintendo Switch. But haters aside, getting into the story is, I have to start off and I have to be honest, it's cryptic. And I mean like M. Night Shyamalan levels of cryptic. Like cryptic that you could beat the game and you most likely will not have a good handle on the subtext and the lore. And that's only partially due to the fact the game does have multiple endings. But suffice to say, just like every other adventure game out there, you're playing as a good guy trying to beat the bad guys, because if you were playing as a bad guy trying to beat the good guys, you might be conflicted. And nobody wants that. And yes, the story and subtext and all the other elements wrapped up with the narrative are going to be something that we're going to be talking about in the critiques. But moving on to the actual gameplay mechanics itself, if you are a fan of games like Salt and Sanctuary or certain more Souls-like games, then you're probably really going to enjoy Vigil. But I do have to qualify that by saying that does depend on your personal proclivities toward visual aesthetic. Because while the game's visuals in general may draw you in immediately, some gamers, myself included, might not really appreciate the complete value of the paper cutout style animations. But again, back to the actual gameplay. This is yet another Metroid-vania inspired game, though it is straight up a fast-paced and fairly intense 2D action platformer. Most of the game's focus will be on map exploration, as well as leveling up your character and fleshing out multiple fairly in-depth skill trees. But in order to make it deeper into the game, you will be having to dominate bosses, gain new abilities, and liberally backtrack to areas that may have previously been unreachable. That being said, the further that you do get into the game, the enemy portfolio expands exponentially, and so does the difficulty. And it's in the boss fights themselves that certain people might be very well justified in saying that there is an element of a Souls-like. And this is because the boss fights are short and to the point, and you will be dying a lot until you figure out that absolutely perfect timing to be able to abuse any loopholes in their attack patterns to actually take them down. Thankfully though, Vigil has liberal checkpoints. Well, I mean, in the beginning it has liberal checkpoints. And there's generally one somewhere in the proximity of every one of the boss rooms, and being that there's absolutely no penalty for death other than having to restart your progress from that checkpoint, you will be able to experiment with the boss's attack patterns pretty much as you like until you move past. And so in that sense, while the fights might be Dark Souls difficult, they're not truly in that Souls genre. Because other than a little bit of backtracking, there's no other penalty for death. Leveling up, of course, is going to help, and the more that you kill, the more that you grind, the higher your level is going to go, and it's going to go up fast, which is something I personally wasn't really ready for. And I mean fast like you're going to think that you're possibly extorting some sort of game hack by how quickly your level's going to go up just from basic combat. But that's because while gaining levels doesn't help you out a ton, what it does is it gets you skill points, and those skill points have to be spent in the hundreds to be able to achieve all that's attainable in the game. Every single weapon type, whether that's your sword, your heavy melee weapon, dual blades or a bow, or even spending points directly on the main character themselves, it's going to take a lot of skill point investment to really get any of the bigger benefits. Which does bring up a really good point, is that Vigil isn't just a 2D action platformer with an intense Metroid-vania theme. The RPG elements not only give the game a bit of scale, but they make the gameplay itself really customizable. And while it may behoove you to pick one weapon type to stick with so you can actually power it up and get some buffs, later in game, having a diversity in your weapons portfolio all buffed out with as many skill points as you can afford is certainly going to work to your favor, because not only does every weapon have its own skill tree, but it also has its own special ability, such as the sword's ability to block, but the dual blade's ability to dodge in place and counter-strike. Moving into the game's aesthetics though, its visual and its audio appeal, like I said earlier, the general graphics, or the graphics in general, are something that a player is definitely going to be drawn to, especially the background elements and the character design. But also, as I mentioned early on, that whole paper cutout animation thing does, possibly due to an oversaturation in the mobile market, feel a bit mobile. And while I'm sure that animation style does take a lot of effort, it just seems to pale in comparison of all of the other visual aesthetics going on in the game. The audio soundtrack, though, is intense and horrifying, and I'd say is perfectly suited for this type of adventure. But as with every single game out there are a handful of things a gamer might want to know about before diving in with their time or their money. And first off, the biggest one, the giant elephant in the room that I addressed right from the beginning of the review, is the game's narrative. I mean, there's cool stuff going on. There's all this eldritch horror, Lovecraftian tribute, and all this body horror going on with all the evil characters, mostly the bosses, and so much dripping gore through the backgrounds and scenes and stages through the entire game that it does not make sense. That the narrative, character dialogues, and even side quests are just something that the player's gonna want to click through with the A button as fast as humanly possible. And that's partially because the dialogues between characters are just a giant text dump, and partially because the deep, rich subtext of the game just seems mal-aligned. I mean, it's a fast game with hack and slash combat and heavy and light attacks, and boss fights that can be over in like 4 seconds. So granted, a gamer who's into that kind of experience isn't going to want to spend 45 minutes of the game walking through a town doing short quests and reading text box after text box about a hexagonal candle. It's just the wrong audience. And this is coming from a guy who likes story games. Other than the light critique for the visuals and the somewhat more scathing critique for the narrative though, there are a couple of things that stand out, and one of them is the equipment system in the game. Though I didn't personally experience or collect every single collectible artifact in the entire game, I feel like there was a bit too much going on, and this again connects kind of to the lore. Suits made of human flesh, or a ring that does that, or a thing that does this, and then being able to modify and enchant and upgrade. While certainly everything you can squeeze out of the game is going to help you toward the end, there's just a whole lot going on. And that combined with the fact that every single different aspect of your character, whether it's the character themselves or the type of weapon they choose to upgrade, having a different skill tree that requires a complete reinvestment of skill points for every single one of them, well, that might distance certain types of gamers from the experience, specifically those who like to go in like the hack and slash that this actually looks like it is. Because while it might play like a hack and slash, the mechanics underneath are an intensely meticulous RPG. But if you do like the old school classic dungeon crawler RPG style item inventory and upgrade systems, then you might really appreciate the extreme nuance that was put into that particular mechanic. But all in all, pushing back from the table for a minute and considering what it was that I had experienced, I have to say the biggest grievance, at least for myself personally, is the fact that it was so difficult to tell exactly what it was that was going on, that it was really hard for me to invest myself into my character in order to enjoy anything other than the raw combat itself, which was inarguably satisfying. And so if you are expecting a mercilessly brutal paper cutout hack and slash like Odin Sphere on the PSP, you need to be ready for the fact that there's a lot going on, and there's even more going on that you probably might never understand without multiple playthroughs. But anyway, that does about bring us to the close of the review of Vigil, The Longest Night for the Nintendo Switch. So if you enjoyed the review, or especially if you found it helpful, feel free to throw us a comment or a like to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. Because we are putting out 2 reviews a week of indie games you've probably never even heard of, and with thousands and thousands of indie games out there, and new and unique ones coming out literally every single day, whether it's an easy hard pass or an absolutely unforgettable gem, chances are if it's on the Switch, you're going to find out about it right here. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamers. As always, thanks for watching.